Chemical Affair by Karianne Hutchinson. Read to you by Karianne Hutchinson. Foreword by C.S. Madsen.
I first met Karianne Hutchinson in 2010 at college, where I presume we were both studying what we wanted to be when we grew up. As a visual artist, her imagination was incredible. If you remain unaware of her abilities, you can get a sample of them by taking another look at the cover art for this book. We've kept in touch over the years, even meeting for drinks a handful of times and consulting on small artistic projects. A robust 15 years after we met, she approached me in April of 2025 to review her first draft of Chemical Affair, a work born only a month prior. The authors I worked with previously had each spent years on their manuscripts. Their documents were riddled with the gamut of what you might expect to find in an unpolished work. Contrary to popular belief, even the most brilliant writers make mistakes. The manuscript Karianne put in front of me, a tale that had been penned in less than 2 months, felt far from a first draft. It was refined. It was well put together. It was dazzling. From a technical viewpoint, this was on a whole different level from what I was accustomed to editing, though her quite possibly unequaled attraction to M-dashes is now an infamous point of playful banter between us. Take a deep breath. This near-future science fiction is about to drag you deep into philosophical and dystopian waters. While you're immersed, you will encounter the rare and beautiful creature known as synesthesia. Once you resurface at the last turn of the page, inhale once more. The air you breathe will be filled with an expanded understanding of the world around you. You will have just traveled the paths of an unforgettable journey. The darkly believable world Karianne has crafted for you is a glimpse into a future that is evocative, vibrant, and raw. Each of the characters is unique, their laughter and tears nearly as real as your own. It is my great pleasure to provide you with this introduction to Karianne Hutchinson's first work, Chemical Affair. We can only hope it will be the start of a large oeuvre of literary offerings. I hope you enjoy it even half as much as I did. Now, it's time for you to experience what you're here for. It's time for you to draw a long breath and dive deep. Enjoy the swim.
Part 1. Cassia. Chapter 1. No clean laundry had made it back into the dresser by the end of the week. Again. Cassia hunted through the clothes basket next to it instead, hoping to find her favorite scrubs. It was just after dawn on a Friday, and she was using the dim glow through the windows instead of turning on any lights. She nearly jumped out of her skin when a notification popped loudly above her. Nobody texted her this early, or ever. She turned the screen face up. It was from her manager. "I'm not coming in to work. Going out with my mom to celebrate her birthday. See you next week." Cassia sent a series of supportive celebratory emojis in response. They didn't match the bitterness she felt at the thought of birthdays, or moms, or going out to celebrate things. She turned the phone back over, then promptly gave up on the hunt and pulled out the first matching top and bottoms she could find. She walked down the hall to her kitchen, passing doors she hadn't opened in a few years, and grabbed a yogurt and her keys. On her way out of the apartment complex, she checked her mailbox. Nothing. Under the covered parking, Cassia glanced at her car's passenger door panel. "Deline bitch," it had said more than a year ago. The shop had done a great job matching its body paint to remove the vandalism, but like a stain on carpet, she was paranoid its edges were still detectable. After waiting at several empty stoplights on her way to work, scanning her badge for the parking garage, and pulling into the closest available spot, Cassia entered Primia's security checkpoint. She pulled her ID badge lanyard over her head, then surrendered her phone, keys, and wallet to the security desk. The guard tucked them into a cubby without attempting conversation. Cassia walked through the detector with empty pockets and a normal temperature. The facility doors opened. When she got to the break room to start the day with coffee, the lab technician from Biolab 12 was on her way out. She apologized for leaving as Cassia was arriving, promising to catch up next week. Cassia watched her disappear beyond the lift doors after scanning her ID, and filled a paper cup at the coffee machine. She revisited the nostalgia for Primia's singular connected master lab when she'd worked on a bustling team of technicians. Nearly a decade ago, they had been subdivided, by space and personnel, to eliminate cross-contamination instances. Cassia was one of the few employees who remembered the biolab floor before the remodel. The new layout made sense over it all, but it left behind a few strange corners and niches. Some left-brained techs found them abominable, but Cassia liked the privacy. Her office was tucked behind one such awkward corner, just out of view from the nearest ceiling camera. She had nothing to hide exactly. It just reminded her of the cubbyholes she'd relied on while growing up. Her sample collection and offline computer reporting were the only unsupervised parts of her job. The actual analysis and research were always on surveillance. The break room was still common, at least. Cassia sat at an empty table next to the window to enjoy some sunlight before going below ground. 2 pairs of habitat technicians entered. Habtechs weren't scientists. They operated as mobile security, tasked with safeguarding expensive assets between all Primia's different lab spaces, mostly just in the building, but sometimes between facilities. They talked amongst themselves frequently, but weren't openly friendly with anyone else. This group was chatting excitedly. Cassia sipped at her drink and listened in, catching bits of their conversation. She passed their news to Jude an hour later, down in Biolab 1, as she started his blood draw. "Hey, Jude," she said. "I heard you're being given a new mate." Deline research made a lot of people touchy, and many scientists were too uncomfortable to work with them. But Cassia hadn't suffered the anxiety herself. You couldn't tell by looking at them that they weren't human anyways. There were only a handful of deline research companies in the world, and fewer than 1,000 adult specimens alive. In ecological terms, that would qualify delines as an endangered species. But since they'd all been grown in labs, the threat of their creation was often seen as categorically worse than any possible extinction. Working directly with a specimen was an early twist to Cassia's career, influenced by a political ebb in funding. She had only hired on as a biochem undergrad to track markers in deline blood samples. But in an effort to streamline staff numbers and increase their utility, Primia sponsored every biolab technician through a crash phlebotomy course. Once she was certified for sample collection, she drew Jude's blood herself. After she had met him, it became obvious that delines weren't mutant superheroes or prisoners of war. She could carry on and ignore all the ridiculous internet speculation. Her clearance level was still too low to be involved in any classified genetic development or interfacility trade, but her role was still important, and the salary was competitive. Jude's original mate had died a year ago. Not surprising, given the fragility of such a new species. Primia's entire program functioned as a breeding initiative. The goal was to create stronger offspring through natural conceptions and pregnancies, eliminating the need to grow delines in glass bottles with a success rate below 1%. Jude himself had come from a subsidiary grow lab. His own offspring, J1 through J5, were considered premium currency in the narrow, fiercely competitive deline market. His designation would sit at the top of many pedigrees if Primia could keep up the pace. After Jude's mate's death, Primia's project director relentlessly began presenting Jude with replacement options. Jude wasn't interested, not even experimentally. His unsuccessful pairing eventually pushed the director to appeal to Primia's executive board, prompting a vote to intervene with supplemental hormones to spark Jude's libido. Dr. Collett was a businessman, not a scientist, but he made a convincing case. Biolab 1 had received shipment of the first hormone dose yesterday, and Cassia had unpacked it into the reagent refrigerator herself. She knew firsthand there was no prescription cure for grief, but resigned to do her job. It was irritating her that executives who'd never met Jude were going to push him around chemically. Tampering with the biochemistry of any living thing had consequences. This might be the last time Primia would fund the expensive delivery of another qualified female specimen. If it didn't work, they would probably resort to farming out Jude's sperm to pay off their investors. Cassia had only meant to make small talk, hoping that by giving Jude a heads up, he might have the chance to psychologically adjust to the introduction of yet another new mate, but she doubted he would care this time. She wasn't ready for his response when he replied, "You are my mate." "What?" She laughed, a little startled. "How do you mean?" She lifted his shirt sleeve and scrubbed his shoulder with an alcohol pad, then plunged in the newly prescribed hormone booster cocktail. He probably hadn't misspoken. His speech wasn't that bad. But perhaps Cassia had misunderstood him. Jude bore the injection calmly. He didn't answer her until she withdrew the needle and circled her thumb on the puncture site with a gloved hand. Then he looked into her eyes and repeated himself. You are my mate. Oh, well. Her body responded first, warmth rushing under her skin, but she looked downwards and kept her expression neutral. Delines looked human, and she certainly found him attractive, but he was genetically a different species, Homo delineae. He was intellectual property, worth an order of magnitude more than her salary, but he couldn't comprehend it. He wasn't even socialized enough to be teasing her. She'd have to stay professional and let him down gently. That's not technically allowed, she replied, playfully acknowledging reality without directly objecting to it. The heat in her face was hard to ignore as she focused on taping his arm and removing her gloves. Jude and his mate had been together as many years as Cassia had been married. She missed waking up in the same bed as someone. She missed flowers on the table, texts on her phone, and events in her calendar. She was lonely, and it made sense that Jude was too. Maybe he would like his new mate this time. She squeezed his arm warmly, his signal to stand, then walked him around the corner from the sample collection chair and out through Biolab 1's doors. The Habtechs who had escorted Jude there waited to accompany him back to the habitat clearance lift at the end of the hall. Once they were out of sight, she collected the tray of samples from her corner, then scanned her ID for entry to the more environmentally controlled, camera-surveyed lab space. Cassia interacted directly with Jude for less than 10 minutes each week, but she was solely in charge of measuring and tracking his biomarker data for the rest of it. It was a lot for one person alone. The redundant cleaning and calibrating equipment on top of the research was enough to make anyone batty, and she wished she could play music or even hang photos on the wall. If she could carry a tune, she might have hummed. She powered up machines and drew syringes of Jude's blood from the sample vials under the laminar flow hood to start growing cultures for the weekend. His latest words wrote about on her shoulder as she fell into her normal rhythm. My mate, he'd called her. A few decades ago, another lab had spliced human and deline genes in petri dish embryos before the experiment had lost funding. It was barely legal to create the delineation of the human genome, and despite even sharing the same number of chromosomes, it was definitely illegal to combine it back with a real Homo sapiens DNA. Deline design had undergone so much genetic tinkering in its infancy, she doubted any viable hybrid was possible outside of a lab that was at least 10 times more well-funded. Her pockets were empty before stepping back through the security checkpoint that evening. She double-checked, even for something as innocent as a paperclip. It would be a rookie mistake to accidentally take Primia property out of the building. She'd done it twice, a pen during her first week and a latex glove after her bereavement leave. The embarrassment of the subsequent shakedown made every technician a fast learner. After clearing the parking garage and turning up her radio, she left for the weekend. She stopped on her way home to pick up groceries and then carried them up the stairs to her apartment. As she set the bags in the kitchen, Cassia realized that she'd emptied her pockets at Primia, but she'd taken Jude's words home with her. My mate echoed in her head on repeat. Once she realized it was happening, it drifted into other names, coming from another voice. My love, my sweet, and on special occasions, my spice. She walked down her hallway, hurried past the shut door, and retreated to take a shower. Jude's strange but flattering statement waited in the nooks between the rest of her routine weekend tasks. Tasks like sleeping in, rewatching shows, and ordering takeout, even though she just went food shopping. Oddly, he was the closest thing she had to a friend anymore. When she poured herself a glass of wine and tried to find a new show to watch on Sunday night, her attention drifted back to how Jude had asked about her thickening summer freckles last week, and how he always commented when she wore her favorite perfume. Somehow, he even knew when she'd forgotten to eat breakfast. Each blood draw felt like a fleeting weekly date with an affectionate, cryptic foreigner. Cassia would be lucky to actually date a person like him, especially considering the disaster of her most recent attempt to pair up online a few months ago. She had spent more than a week exchanging messages with the man before planning a dinner together, but then needed a rain check on the evening they were supposed to meet because her car wasn't starting. Thankfully, he'd agreed to reschedule, and her car behaved itself the next time around. They had already weighed some of their baggage between texts, finding they were nicely balanced. The man was divorced and she was widowed, but nobody was bringing kids to the table. Their in-person chemistry had been generally well-matched, too. They both liked the same sappy power ballad on the radio, the same unpopular dish at the restaurant, and they swapped embarrassing sorority and fraternity stories. When the conversation had switched from their degrees to their careers, and Cassia had finished a second drink, he'd asked, I noticed you didn't list your employment on your profile, and I don't want to be rude, but do you work? Oh, yeah, she'd shrugged. I'm in the research sector. It's not very interesting, though. I can't believe you get paid to camp in a state park. Are there any bears? What's your title? He'd countered, undistracted. I just analyzed blood samples. It's really no big deal. Cassia had waved her hand, trying to downplay, but he fired off another question. Which company? She had paused with worry, but decided to risk the truth. I work for Primia. Wait, you mean the one that keeps delines? His face darkened. She tried to change the subject, but it was too late. He looked disgusted. Do you know what they do to them? How they're treated? Cassia had faltered at a sudden anger, then defended herself. I'm not allowed to discuss my work. It's classified. You're sick, he'd said, and stood up, pulling a few bills from his wallet, then slapped them on the table before leaving. She never heard from him again, and she hadn't gone on another date since. Internally, she admitted that the cost of most research was morally ambiguous, an eternal trade war between data and ethics. But Leo hadn't minded. He hadn't exactly known the depth of her work, since most of it was locked beneath non-disclosure documentation, but he'd at least trusted her to make her own choices. Cassia would no doubt leave if Primia started abusing their delines, and she would be the first to flag any suspicious rise in stress hormones in Jude, but she had never even seen a scratch on him. He was perfectly healthy, generally happy, and always seemed glad to see her. Come to think of it, she was always glad to see him too. Chapter 2. Cassia spent the hours between the biolab equipment and her office computer the next week wondering if Jude would tell one of the Habtechs what he had said to her. He wasn't an employee who could be punished for breaching behavioral contracts, but she was, and she certainly could be. The breeding female arrived. The news spread quickly once she'd passed quarantine and been introduced to Jude. Cassia lacked Hab clearance, so the gossip needed to be compelling enough to spill into the break room or cafeteria. She found herself lingering longer over coffee breaks, eavesdropping for any updates. No mating had been reported. The species was barely more than half a century old, still in scientific infancy. The technology remained imperfect and prohibitively expensive. Research facilities safeguarded their patents and spent months or years negotiating trade. Some of the earliest specimens had been wiped out by contagions. It was why Primia adopted a pair-bonding breeding model, rather than the more risky but more productive harem systems favored by competitors. Fewer biomes meant fewer variables. Viral or bacterial invasion was just one of the many risks Cassia's weekly blood cultures were designed to detect. She was curious to see if any biomarkers reflected Jude's sudden declaration, but last week's samples were all within normal parameters. However, the new hormone prescription would show up and shift a lot of ongoing data points. As she scrolled through previous reports, she found herself lingering on the weeks surrounding the death of Jude's mate a year ago. The memory pulled her even further back to a darker time, the week she returned to work after losing Leo and their son. Jude had noticed something was wrong and asked, "What is different?" "Oh, Jude, I'm sorry. I was gone for so long, I didn't have time to tell you," Cassia had apologized. She sighed, sterilizing his arm. "My husband died." "What is husband?" he'd asked. "A husband is like a mate," she'd explained. "What has died?" Jude asked next, and Cassia had hesitated with the vacutainer needle. He hadn't lost his own mate yet. She would have to explain mortality to someone who had no context for it. "His body stopped working. His heart doesn't beat anymore. He's gone. For always." She'd aimed her stick and filled 10 vials, tears falling from her face and dripping onto the plain cotton of Jude's shirt as she bent over his arm. When she'd finished, Jude lifted the darkened spot to his face and quietly examined it. He wouldn't fully understand Cassia's loss for another year, when his own mate succumbed to organ failure. The news of the death had already been reduced internally to words like tissue analysis confirmed, failed intervention, and subject deceased. That week, Jude had entered the biolab in a heavy silence, wordlessly holding out his arm for collection. Cassia had paused, set the needle back onto her cart, then reached out to squeeze his hand. He'd never cried in front of her before or since, but Cassia understood too well the kind of tears he'd shed that day. The quiet collapse of Jude's bonding hormones showed up in her reports for months, and they were only recently approaching his pre-loss levels. It was a chance that Primia wouldn't waste, but Cassia wasn't sure which outcome she was actually rooting for. Jude's next blood draw began normally. He entered Biolab 1 through the outer doors, barefooted, leaving his assigned pair of haptics to wait in the hall. Cassia led him around the corner and arranged her cart with familiar ease. She took vitals, filled vials, and signed labels on autopilot. It rained this morning, she explained when he asked about her damp hair. Jude nodded quietly, but his attention lingered on her. She administered the hormone booster and avoided the eye contact he kept trying to catch. Is she nice? Cassia prompted, hoping to hear Jude's assessment of the breeding female firsthand, but not wishing to be rude. Yes, he answered, though without feeling. That's good, she replied, taping his arm. You deserve a nice mate. You are my mate, Jude said with his level, matter-of-fact tone. Cassia stopped working and looked earnestly into his face. Jude, that's really sweet of you, and it would be nice to be your mate. But you can't choose me. I'm not made the way you are. It won't work. It will work, he disagreed, softly. Then he reached out and gently held the hem of her lab coat between his thumb and index finger. Jude, what are you? She began, but paused. For a moment, she only watched. Her pulse thudded rapidly in her face, ears, and throat. Slowly, Jude undid a single button. The moment shattered when the Habtech's voices echoed from around the corner, down the hall. She stiffened, glancing toward the sound. Jude's expression was only curious. Cassia rehoused the button with forced calm, then walked Jude back for handoff, her cheeks burning, though not unpleasantly. Once Jude was gone, she busied herself on the biolab, loading the centrifuge and starting cultures. She told herself the hormone boost must have affected him. The truth was harder to ignore. He'd made his intentions known last week. The rest of her afternoon was an internal battle between her professional and personal desires. She wondered what would have happened if she hadn't stopped him, then steered herself away from dwelling on it. She should report Jude's behavior to her manager. Nobody would know to log it except Cassia, since they had been beyond the camera's reach. But there was a high possibility she would be reassigned. She rationalized instead that Jude deserved a pass. It had just been a bad moment. She'd had her own worst moment 2 years ago, tucked away out of sight from the world. If people had documented what she'd done, how she'd felt, it was impossible to imagine. She replayed the memory of Jude's fingers at the edge of her coat as she drove home in silence. She wished she could have done something else with that moment, but couldn't decide what that something else should have been. Chapter 3. The following morning, Cassia found herself re-downloading her thrice-deleted dating app. Miraculously, it had saved her profile, though none of her previous matches. She ate breakfast, scrolling and swiping with fresh start energy. By the evening, however, she remembered why it had been months since she deleted it. So many of the same faces. She thought they would have been long gone, but they were all still circling the same drain. She even remembered a few of their abysmal bachelor pads, but at least they had mustered the courage to invite her over. Bringing a date to her apartment was her worst nightmare. She would have to lie and say that she had just moved in to explain the glaring absence of photos, art, or whimsical fridge magnets. She wouldn't admit it was all stuffed in garbage bags under a crib. When she woke up on Sunday morning, there was a message waiting for her on the app. From a man named Gary. Hi, short notice, but do you want to get a coffee today? Well, that was pretty straightforward. It probably worked on a lot of pragmatic women who didn't want to waste time texting for a week. Cassia scrolled through his bio. Gary was her age, and a mechanic or a fabricator of some kind. He had a dog. She didn't have anywhere to be today. Coffee sounded like an easy first step. She messaged him back. That sounds great. Where do you want to meet? Gary sent her a map pin and a proposed time. Cassia hesitated. She'd been to that Main Street cafe hundreds, maybe even thousands of times. It shared a building with Lion Floral. She took a large breath, gave the message a thumbs up, then looked for something to wear. Something not scrubs. Gary was chatty, which turned out for the best, because Cassia was struggling to focus as they sat on the outdoor patio with their orders. From their table, she could see them. The bouquets, the vases, the sandwich board. Is everything okay? Gary asked after a pause had drifted into awkward territory. Cassia realized she was white-knuckling her coffee mug and winced. Yes, sorry. You said you found Cookie at a shelter? Gary perceptibly tracked her gaze, turned around to look at the window display behind him. When he rotated back to face her, Cassia couldn't think of anything believable to explain why flowers would make her so tense. The truth slipped out instead. My husband owned that shop. He died. Oh my God, what? I am so sorry. Gary stood up, clattering the spoons on the tabletop. He told her they could find another cafe. He knew of one a few blocks away. Cassia apologized in turn, urging him to sit back down. No, it's my fault. I could have asked you to pick another spot. I just thought I would handle it better. I've never imagined being a florist. What was he like? Gary asked, genuinely interested. Cassia folded her napkin a few times, embarrassed it was taking so long to propagate words from her thoughts. Gary waited. She finally said, "He was the kindest person I'd ever known. I don't think I ever deserved him." Gary smiled sympathetically and urged her to keep talking. Surprisingly, it helped. Before they stood an hour later, he reached across the table and touched her wrist. It wasn't as intimate as reaching for her hand, but only slightly less so. He said, "I want to make this up to you. How about dinner on Thursday? You can choose where." The skin where he had touched her felt electric, alive. It made the rest of her skin feel dormant, or maybe dead. Cassia was feeling off guard from his goodwill, raw from talking about her husband, and guilty for not bringing up more. She really wanted another chance to show Gary that she wasn't a complete mess. They agreed on a dinner date, and he walked her to her car. Her week brightened while she anticipated seeing him again. When she retrieved her phone from the security desk after work each evening, she usually had a message waiting. They were mostly pictures of Cookie, captioned with emojis. On Tuesday evening, she got her hair trimmed. On Wednesday, she took the afternoon off to shop for a new dress. Then, on Thursday, a small protest had coalesced at Primia's parking garage entrance. The director requested that all technicians stay in the building until law enforcement could clear a path for exit traffic. Cassia joined her coworkers in the cafeteria after clocking out. The newest employees were anxious. They hadn't worked for Primia long enough to remember when marches on its doorstep had been more frequent. Once, famously, a protester had broken free of the barrier of Habtex and had set foot inside the building. Cassia heard the story being told again in the low chatter as she watched a wall clock ticking closer to her dinner date. She didn't have her phone to message Gary if she would be late. To make use of the time, she left to use the restroom mirror to braid her hair, twisting it around and back for a sophisticated effect. It would need some product at home, but at least she could give herself a head start. When she finished and re-entered the cafeteria, everyone had left. She glanced at the clock and was relieved she could still be on time if she hurried a little. She reclaimed her belongings, started up her car, and drove under Primia's garage gate when it lifted. There were a handful of littered paper signs, torn up and abandoned beside it. Someone had made their last stand by planting their picket into the turf. "Free them," it said as Cassia drove past. She turned off the campus road and made for home. The protesters couldn't understand. D-lines wouldn't survive outside. They would live as miserably and die as quickly as captive-bred tigers dumped into the wild. Their immune systems were too unprotected, their viability too empirically unproven. Cassia finished getting ready at home in a rush, then arrived at the restaurant a few minutes early. She gave Gary's name to the host for the wait list, then stood outside for 15 minutes. Once a table was available, she waited inside for 20 more. When she opened her app to check if Gary had asked to reschedule, his messages had disappeared. She typed his name in the search bar and stared. His bio was completely gone. Deleted. She ordered takeout before leaving, because it felt less pathetic than walking away empty-handed. But the bag sat untouched on her kitchen table all night. She opened the app once more just in case. Her own face smiled back at her from the profile photo in the corner. Cassia closed it down, held her thumb on the icon, then wiped it clear. Chapter 4. Cassia woke before her alarm the next morning, pawed through the laundry for scrubs, drove to work, drank her coffee, then prepared the biolab. She was way ahead of schedule, but only barely ahead of her feelings. She wasn't even sad exactly. She was furious for being so gullible and embarrassed for hoping. She didn't know anything about Gary. She'd spent the whole date unpacking herself in front of her dead husband's dream, and for all she knew, Gary was still married and looking for a fling. He probably blasted out that coffee date message and met 6 more women before finding someone to his taste, someone who didn't come off nearly as desperate. Jude still hadn't mated with the D-line female, and Cassia couldn't help but feel sorry for her. To kill time, she unlocked the overstock supply closet and started taking inventory, cleaning out the empty cartridges and consolidating partially used boxes of consumables. The space was small enough that she banged her elbow on the corner of the metal shelf and let fly a string of profanity. It was the sound of the habitat lift doors that brought her to the present. She backed out of the closet and around the corner in time to see Jude appear at Biolab 1's doors. He met her eyes and gave a rare, open smile. The tension in her shoulders disappeared. She waved him forward, and the escorting habtech stayed behind the threshold. Cassia washed her hands at the sink beside his chair while he sat. She asked over her shoulder, "How are you today, Jude?" Here was one conversation that would never get deleted. "Good," he said, then asked her in return, "How are you?" How could she put it simply? "I'm here." She dried her hands, put on gloves, and asked, "Do you want left arm or right arm?" Jude extended his right arm for the blood draw. Cassia got to work, bending close enough to feel his body's warmth and to smell his skin. He smelled good. Her heart started up again, like when he'd removed her button, but she kept her mouth shut. The years of practice kept her hands steady with the needle. Once she'd finished filling each sample vial, administered his booster, taped his arm, and begun taking off her gloves, Jude leaned in close. "I'll be fast," he promised, and started undoing her buttons again from the chair. Heat rushed through her, pooling in her abdomen, and thudded low. She put her hands firmly over his, stalling. She wouldn't let him. She knew better. But then Jude slid his hands to her waist, pulling her stomach to his face. It set to flame the aching tug in her soul to be touched. She closed her eyes. There was the muffled echo of the habtechs talking, the sound of her own pulse in her ears, then the feeling of Jude inhaling below, fingers lifting her coat. Cassia needed to be wanted, and Jude wanted her. He was the only person in the world who did. She looked at the open door of the supply closet, quietly pulled Jude to his feet, and backed him inside. She shut the door behind them. It was completely dark, minus the thin line of light under the door. The barely outlined shadow of Jude pulled Cassia's waistband down. She held the edge of the supply shelf and surrendered to the rhythm of their shared primal hunger. The small closet grew hot, and she felt the sweat break out on his skin. He was fast, which Cassia was both grateful for and disappointed by. A few of the shelved items clattered to the floor, but nothing broke. He stilled and panted into the back of her neck. As the ecstasy receded, the fear crept forward. Cassia groped in the dark for her pants, heart sinking. What had she done? Did anyone see? Jude countered her anxiety with calm, as though nothing had happened. She opened the closet door, straightening her coat. Jude followed her out to Biolab 1's doors, and the habtechs took him back, none the wiser. She spent the rest of the day burying herself in reports and long-procrastinated tasks, but her hands kept misfiring at the keyboard. She left the computer and found the time to deep clean some of the lab equipment, disassembling incubator shelves and filters to sanitize their components. The memory of the closet replayed relentlessly, exhilarating, shameful, and strange. It hadn't felt like a mistake in the moment. That was the worst part, where she couldn't make sense of herself. She wished she could see him again, sooner, then felt so embarrassed that she never wanted to see him again. She had a week to pull herself back together. That evening, Cassia tackled backed-up laundry, sorted her pantry, went on a run, and showered like she could expunge a crime. She wasn't a rebound girl. She wasn't impulsive. She wasn't entirely sure what had come over her. Sex with Jude would have to stay a one-time thing. She turned out her lights and climbed into bed, but laid awake, hour over hour. Was this how cheaters felt? She had never cheated on Leo, but she'd heard the stories. People accidentally fell for each other and got busy all the time without knowing why it had happened. It just happened. Either way, she told herself, it couldn't happen again. Cassia turned her pillow over, wondering if that's what cheaters told themselves too. Chapter 5. Cassia's stomach was in knots the next week when she consolidated and submitted Jude's data, prominently displaying the hormonal markers. Primia's gossip circle was convinced he would breed with the female in the habitat once Dr. Collett began treating the company's investors to congratulatory ego-petting dinners. Jude's comeback success in the deline breeding program was all but assumed. Biolab 1 had never been cleaner. Cassia even found the time to read a few of the equipment manuals while she dodged her sneaking fantasy. She couldn't even look at the closet door without abruptly going back into the lab to check the enzyme panels or leaving the office for the break room. She wasn't safe there either, because she would overhear conversations about Jude from the rotation of Habtechs. They speculated that the going rate for Jude's natural offspring was in the millions of dollars above Primia's other D-line projects. Whether or not the rumors were true, she threw her unfinished cups of coffee in the trash and retreated back to Biolab 1, resolved to keeping her bearing on Friday morning. She really thought she'd be ready. However, when Jude arrived for his next blood draw, all her carefully stacked resolve began to slide. The shape of him in the door, the gentle expression on his face, and the ease with which he sat in his chair completely disarmed her. He wasn't even doing anything. She didn't trust herself to say hello, because she hadn't prepared herself for whatever he might say back. Instead, she kept her gloves on and her expression neutral. She meant to turn away. She always meant to. But after she'd taped his arm, Jude caught her hand, without force, without question, and guided her toward the supply closet. Cassia found herself pulling at his clothes, breaking into a sweat, and clinging to him in the dark. It happened again the following Friday, and the Friday after that. By the 5th week, Cassia's sense of self-preservation caught up with her. She had to end it. The fear of being discovered was constantly derailing her focus. Her guilt outlasted each sexual charge, and then gnawed at her from all angles of work. Her evenings only grew worse, as anxiety transformed most of her neglected unit into a sparkling showroom apartment. She had, honest to God, even dusted the baseboards. She mostly worried Jude would blow their cover. Part of their unspoken affair was just that, unspoken. When he walked through Biolab 1's doors, Cassia didn't start their normal small talk. She didn't even ask him which arm he wanted needled. Afraid the moment was too fragile, she said nothing. Jude seemed to understand the need for privacy during their encounters, but she had no way of knowing if he comprehended the need to extend the secrecy for always, unless she found the courage to ask him. Even then he might not understand. Her best bet was to make a clean exit. On Tuesday, she submitted a formal request to transfer. Her manager responded warmly, even stopping by to chat about the opportunities in other D-line projects and in ancillary labs elsewhere. Lab turnover was common, and Cassia's tenure at Primia was practically unheard of. She could basically take her pick. By Wednesday morning, Cassia was browsing through the listings her manager had forwarded and filing some tertiary data onto the servers for whomever would replace her. Getting organized was a stroke of luck, because that afternoon, Primia's IT department ordered a 2-hour systems blackout after suspecting a hacking attempt on their servers. Cassia's manager had scanned her ID for Biolab 1 and poked her head around the corner wall to give Cassia a 5-minute warning to save and shut down her programs. "When they give us the go-ahead to restart, we have a mandatory password reset," she'd said. "Generous of them to think I remember my passwords," Cassia had joked, mood lighter since she'd finished applying for 3 different open positions in Primia's sister facility across town. She'd even started fantasizing about moving out of her apartment. Wasn't it about time she built new memories somewhere else? She hadn't heard back by Friday, but she had already decided it would be her last week in Biolab 1 regardless. She cashed in some of her unused vacation days to take the next week off, giving the application time to process and the transfer to finalize. She wasn't sure if or how to tell Jude when she followed him into the closet one last time. It felt cowardly, but she didn't want to complicate their final moments with the truth. In the dark, as he lifted the hem of her coat, Jude suddenly stopped. He said the first words she'd heard from him in more than a month. "You're carrying," he said. "Carrying?" Cassia repeated, confused. Jude knelt, his face level with her abdomen. He pressed his forehead gently against her, closed his eyes, and inhaled deeply. "I can smell it," he said with his usual certainty. "You can smell what?" Her voice rose. "I can smell the baby," he said. Cassia's legs threatened to give out. Pregnant? From Jude? Her blood pressure plummeted, then crashed. Chapter 6. Cassia had spent her childhood in a state-subsidized foster center after being removed from her abusive teenaged mother. She was raised in a herd of young girls by a handful of frustrated, underpaid staff members. Leo, on the other hand, had been raised in suburbia as an only child to a pair of old lovebird parents. The commodity of affection between them was abundant. For Cassia, it had been scarce. They met in college, after Cassia had begun working for Primia, but before she'd ever met a D-line in person. She and Leo shared a summer horticulture science course. It was an elective for Cassia, but part of Leo's botany degree. After midterms, he began leaving flower cuttings tucked behind the side view mirror of her car. After finals, he left his number. Nearly a year later, after her graduation ceremony, he drove her an hour away to an arboretum. Beneath the golden blossoms of a cassia fistula, he proposed by slipping a ring into her pocket, letting her decide, in her own time, whether or not to put it on. Leo's parents didn't live long after their wedding, but the inheritance of their son's heart was worth more than what they'd left in their bank accounts. He put both to good use, buying the Main Street shop and hanging their portraits in the entry of Lion Floral during its opening ceremony. He gave every attendee a lily in honor of his mother. Lily had hoped one day for a grandchild, but Cassia wasn't ready to risk motherhood so soon, too worried she'd inherited a set of fractured maternal instincts. Leo had the compassion to wait and to build her confidence while she deliberated. Once she made the decision to try for a family, Leo's joy was boundless. He brought her a rose each night as she rode the off-ramp of hormonal birth control. Months later, when she showed him her first positive pregnancy test, he lifted and spun her around their living room before painting her face in joyful, wet kisses. The roses turned into camellias to count down the weeks. Cassia put on a brave face, but started inwardly spiraling. The sustained anxiety drove her to bury herself further in work, even volunteering to spend overtime testing equipment updates to the biolab, which would later be adapted across projects. Her pregnancy coincided with the gestation of Jude's third offspring. "Your mate is incredible," Cassia told Jude as she drew his blood on a Friday morning. "I can't imagine doing this more than once." Her own stomach was inconveniently swollen, her back tight, and she had an alarming craving to chew on soap. The symptoms made it harder to put off her looming motherhood worries until she got home. When she did, Leo would show her another improvement to the nursery, or how he had started childproofing cupboards. He would read aloud their growing library of children's books and give Cassia his evaluation of baby food brands. He even impulsively bought and assembled 3 different bassinets. All he'd ever wanted to be was a father. "Can I name our son Cassian?" Leo had asked one evening, handing her a bouquet at the door. The note tucked in read, 11 to go. "Ha ha, funny," Cassia warned him playfully. She stalled for time, breathing in the subtle spice of the blossoms. "No, I'm serious." Leo wrapped his arms around her and tucked his fingers in her back pockets. "Isn't that a little too close to Cassia?" she pointed out, eyebrows raised. "That's the point, my love." He kissed her. She kissed him back, but held him in suspense. Leo didn't press. He was good at waiting. Cassia thought for the next several weeks about what it meant to share her own name, to pass it on to someone else. The longer she dwelled, the more her childhood beast stirred within her. What had inspired Cassandra to pass her name to Cassia? Vanity? Pride? It couldn't have been love. Did her mother deserve to have her name passed down again? Cassia was sitting at the kitchen table on a Saturday, watching Leo's face fill her phone screen while he installed the new baby monitor, when she caught sight of the back of an envelope covered in scribbles. She tugged it free of the clutter and bit her lip. Leo had been trying to think of alternative names. Ash, Heath, Rowan, Wren. They were all crossed off. Her own name had been circled lovingly on the address label, a blooming cassia tree doodled all around it. "Okay," she whispered in bed 2 weeks ago. "You can name him Cassian." Chapter 7. Cassia woke up in an unfamiliar wing of the building. She touched her sore face and found a line of stitches marching across her forehead and felt the tug of an IV taped in the back of her hand. Trying to sit up was met with a deep temporal throbbing. Was she concussed? She waited a moment for the pain to fade back, then opened her eyes again. A Habtech stood just beyond the door. A sign at the doorframe read Med Lab 1. This was beyond her badge clearance, where specialists and medtechs treated delines for illness or pregnancies. Her stomach twisted with a sudden rush of memory. Oh shit. Dr. Collett entered without knocking. "What happened?" Cassia asked, head thudding in rising beat with the pulse monitor beside her. His face was unreadable. "That's what I would like to know, Miss Vincent." He held out a tablet, displaying a clip of security footage without audio. The screen showed a ceiling's view of Jude pulling Cassia's unconscious body out through Biolab 1's doors. A trail of blood smeared behind her across the floor. The Habtechs realized what was happening and jumped on him. The recording switched angles and showed Jude trying to fight them off, only to be tackled by a third and fourth tech who came sprinting in from off camera. Cassia was tangled in the chaos. Collett paused the video mid-frame and took off his thickly framed glasses. I questioned Jude personally. Cassia stared at the screen, willing herself not to react. He said you fell, but he also said you were pregnant, and that it's his. The traitorous pulse rate monitor's beeping increased. Cassia began to deny it, but Collett intercepted. We've already taken a blood sample confirming pregnancy. You what? She demanded. Did Jude rape you? He cut her off, point blank. No! She cried, horrified, but the doctor didn't look relieved. Instead, he demanded, Are you seeing anyone else? Someone else who might have gotten you pregnant? Cassia stuttered, failing to procure a lie before he bore down again. Were you coerced? Were you compromised? Was your security breached? Did someone pay you to interfere? Each question cut deeper. Cassia twisted, nausea churning. She barely managed to grab the garbage bin beside the bed before vomiting. Her body trembled, from fear as well as from the fallout from puking. She didn't trust her mouth to speak, and so shook her head slowly. Collett replaced his glasses, his voice hardening. You don't understand what you've done here. This isn't just your job or my job at stake. This is fraud, theft, billions of dollars, thousands of jobs, research liabilities, breeding contracts, litigations. That's not, what are you saying? She interrupted, her voice cracking. It's impossible. He paused to calculate his response. Jude was confident he could impregnate you. He predetermined your physiological compatibility. What? How? Cassia demanded. Collett put his glasses back on, buying a moment before dropping the next blow. Jude is the most chemically sensitive deline specimen alive. He can taste and smell over 22,000 individual compounds, hormones and pheromones among them. Memories collided in Cassia's head, one for each tightening of her gut. Jude inhaling at her stomach, asking about the rain in her hair, the way he'd noticed her tears soaking into his shirt. Other moments, too, how oddly alert he'd seemed when she came in hungover, after a double wasp sting, or after removing her birth control. She had spent 7 years tracking biomarkers in Jude's blood, with hundreds of thousands of dollars of lab equipment, and he had simply smelled hers? Her voice was quiet. Is that what D-lines are going to be for? Collett didn't hesitate. The answer to that is mostly classified, but no, it's just Primia's directive. Other facilities engineer for different reasons. The breeding female you usurped from Naxalon was radiation resistant. She was here on loan for $25 million a quarter. Cassia went still. $25 million? Radiation resistant? What were they building D-lines for? Nuclear cleanup? Space travel? When she finally spoke, her voice cracked. Director, I know how this looks, but I wasn't trying to get pregnant. I was trying to leave. That doesn't matter, Collett said, rising from his chair. His tone was final. Combining human and D-line DNA is illegal. No one outside my personal team knows what happened today, and I'm going to ensure it stays that way. You work for me now. You'll be quarantined, and then you'll deliver the fetus for the breeding program. He stood. What? Cassia stammered, struggling to interrupt, every word costing her a cranial lightning bolt. He continued, unyielding. You are not allowed to leave. You are not allowed to contact anyone. This protects Jude from being put down. It protects you from litigation. It protects Primia from an investigation. He began walking away without waiting for her response. A medtech entered, hung a fresh IV bag, and looped a nylon cable tie around her wrist to the bed frame. Cassia's realization and resistance came too slowly to pull herself free. Collett lingered in the doorframe just long enough to make his final threat. I know you don't believe me yet, but try me. You won't be the first skeleton in my closet. Then he left. Chapter 8. Cassia's skills in enduring isolation were put to the test over the next several days. Her immediate instinct was to escape. She thought to try to cut the zip tie at her wrist, but the room was devoid of tools. Her own food was in solid bars or liquid and gel pouches, so she never even had cutlery to stash away. After a day, the desire to escape bent in submission to the realization that even if she got her arm free, there was a camera, a hab tech at the next door, and any number of ID badge-activated doors after him. Her own ID badge was gone. Better to wait for a different opportunity. Her next phase burned with injustice. Collett abducting her like this was criminal. The way he had threatened to make her a skeleton in his closet made her wonder, if he was willing and capable of getting rid of her, why hadn't he just gotten rid of the fetus? She had been unconscious. He could have had his med techs perform an abortion. She would have woken up in the med lab just the same. And he could have spun an apology about Jude's behavior, denied the pregnancy, paid her workers' compensation, and carried on without going through the trouble of abducting anyone. She wished he had. Collett must believe any fetus of Jude's was valuable enough to justify the risk. It was the only thing that made sense. He was planning something. Why else keep it a secret? His job hadn't been on the line until he took her. And that blood sample? It was probably legally tucked under some buried clause about suspected biogenetic theft. Cassia needed a lawyer, but the only person she had contact with was the medtech, Miguel, who was assigned to monitor her quarantine. She tried to start innocuous conversations with him, hoping his moral compass would guilt him into reporting her missing or into tipping off the local police. But Miguel never spoke. He just silently took her temperature and vitals, brought food packets, and escorted her to the bathroom. The thin barriers of his mask, face shield, and gloves managed to be a wide, impersonal distance. Without his cooperation, Cassia started lamenting her sparse social circle. She had no family, unless by some curse her birth mother was released from her lifetime prison sentence. Her friends were few and remote. There was Maria, who kept in touch from her foster home days, her old roommate Danny from her undergrad years, Leo's older cousin, what's-her-name? Her manager would be looking for her now if she hadn't applied for the transfer and put in for the vacation request. She should have kept in touch with Leo's bands of friends instead of pushing them all away after the funeral. It occurred to Cassia that her landlord might notice, but only if the capital from selling Lion Floral failed to autopay. Her phone battery would be dead long before it received any notifications. As she chased her thoughts in circles about which of her short list of friends might eventually come looking for her, she realized the timeline in her head had shifted from weeks to months. Months before someone would invite her to dinner or send her a happy birthday text. She didn't exist in enough people's minds to count on a rescue. The memory of the lone picket sign, standing in the grass outside Primia more than a month ago, taunted her. Free them. She discarded the depressing image, and in its wake, she finally aimed her anger at its true target. Why had she done it? Why had she had sex with Jude? Wasn't this the kind of selfish, unthinking stupidity her teenaged mother had modeled so well, that had landed Cassia in the hands of the state before she was 2? Was she caught in the same cycle? No, she wasn't her mother. Accidentally pregnant, yes, but at least Cassia hadn't killed anyone. Looking back, her rehoming to state custody felt like proving grounds for her abduction by Primia. Taken from home, belongings gone, reduced to a folder in a cabinet. Her cries for help wouldn't make it past the door. No one would reply. No one loved her. Except apparently Jude. Jude. Cassia had been putting off thinking about him. She wanted to be angrier at him, but he had tried to tell her. He'd even said, "It will work," before she ever took him into the closet. Like an animal smelling a female in heat, he'd apparently known she could carry a hybrid pregnancy. What else did he know? It was easier to think of what Jude didn't know. He couldn't read. She found that out their first day when she pointed to her name on her ID badge. He didn't know colors. She'd taught him as she rotated through different sets of scrubs. He didn't know left from right until she trained him to choose an arm for blood draws. He didn't know how to put on gloves. He didn't know where scars came from. He didn't understand why the air smelled like smoke when someone left a coffee filter on the hot plate in the break room. He wasn't stupid, just experientially maybe only 5 or 6 years old. As old as Cassian would have been. Her stomach twisted. She blinked, forcing back the sting in her eyes. The realization finally landed that Jude had, at the same time, been redeeming the empty space inside her, left by her dead husband and her dead son. He had reached for her as a grown man and lover, but had also spent years looking up to her like a parent. Chapter 9. At the end of the 4th day in quarantine, Cassia was taken in a hospital gown and handcuffs beyond the med lab into a lift. At the bottom, Dr. Collett was just ending a call. To her, he said, "Jude is no longer cooperating with the Chemtechs. His compliance is expensive, and our contracts are backlogging. He's demanding to see you alive." A blood vessel pulsed visibly at his temple, betraying more tension than his voice. He passed his ID over a door security panel at the far end of the room, then ordered her forward, letting the escorting security post behind them. There was another short hallway, and behind one of the 3 ID-locked cell doors, there was Jude. Bruises from his tackling outside of Biolab 1 were fading, but his eyes were freshly red. He was handcuffed, held in place by a pair of habtechs. When he saw Cassia, he sagged in their grip and sobbed. She was escorted immediately out, the door shut. "Wait, can't I talk to him?" she braked. "No," the director said flatly and forced her forward. "Jude should never have the power to demand anything. You've compromised his performance in ways that you clearly don't understand. He may be ruined." Behind them, Jude screamed. The feral noise penetrated even through the vault-like door. Cassia's heart hammered up to her ears, but Collett kept walking. She twisted angrily out of his grip, turning back. "Let me talk to him. I can calm him down." Without warning, the director slapped her, hard. She hit the ground. "You are in no position to negotiate with me," he roared. His phone began ringing, and he walked on, waving the techs forward to collect her from the floor. Her face stung, but not as deeply as her dignity. She had been held against her will for days, but it had felt cold, necessary, procedural. The slap burned. It was personal. Cassia squeezed shameful, sticky tears from her eyelashes as she closed her eyes during the lift ride back up. She was no longer just an agitating employee or an errant colleague to Collett. She was something worse, something he could kill and throw away in the trash. At the thought, her rational thoughts ended. For the first time since being taken, she began to truly panic. When the doors slid open at the med lab floor, adrenaline flooded down through her spine into her legs, and before she even knew what she was doing, Cassia had leapt forward in a sprint down the hallway. The habtechs weren't idiots, and they caught her within moments. Cassia screamed when they did and bawled in their grip like a child. They ignored her cries and reinstated her into the room where she'd been quarantining, locking her wrists to the bed frame again before standing at the door. Cassia turned away from them, face congested with tears of degradation, skin sweaty under the gown while she burned off the embarrassment of it all. That was so stupid. She couldn't let that fight or flight crap get away from her like that again, ever. It would only make things worse. She needed to have a plan. She needed more information. If she could keep it together, Cassia might be smart enough to see a way out. With new resolve, she blew her nose into the sheets beneath her and felt the clenching of her body slowly release. Late the next day, she was retrieved again and rode the lift down more deeply than she'd known the facility's foundation extended. The new pair of Habtech's hands didn't leave her arms. When the lift doors opened, the director was waiting in a glass-walled room a short distance away. The techs escorted her inside, then posted outside the door. Collett gestured to a chair. "I have an offer for you. Please sit." Cassia remained standing. He ignored the defiance, then got straight to business. "For the purposes of efficiency, I'm placing you in Jude's habitat. You will remain there for the duration of your pregnancy. Do not interfere with his work. Do not interfere with his routine. You're expected to submit yourself to all medical or security technicians without resistance for fetal monitoring." It wasn't an offer, it was orders. Was it because she had tried to run yesterday? Or was Jude still being uncooperative? Probably both. Cassia wanted to ask, but needed a longer view of the situation. "What's your plan after it's born?" she probed. "If the hybrid is viable, then we will discuss your further options." He waved the Habtechs back inside and said nothing else. Cassia wasn't returned to the lift, but instead was ushered through an antechamber where the handcuffs were removed. The next set of double doors led into Jude's habitat. Cassia had imagined deline habitats were like a scientific version of a college dorm or a hotel room. She had pictured white-sheeted beds, perfunctory desks, and impersonal bathrooms. Her guesses were unimaginative compared to the truth. The habitat was essentially a concrete tuna can. The space was 20 meters in diameter, circular, and nearly empty. There were a few differently colored lines painted on the ground, radiating out from the two sets of facing doorways like an incorrectly drafted basketball court. The vertical concrete walls were capped with a concrete ceiling, and there wasn't a single fixture reachable without a ladder. Lights, security cameras, vents, sensors, all 5 meters up the wall at least. Near one end of the cylindrical room, the concrete had been treated with a sealant, and the floor was crossed with thin gaps. A drain? The only furnishing was a solid pad on the floor to one side. It was some kind of mattress without sheets, a pillow, or blanket. Jude was laying atop it, and Cassia rushed across to kneel next to him, turning his head to face her and calling his name. He mumbled something incoherent, sedated. She pulled his hand up into hers and waited for him to come around. He remained still, except for the rise and fall of his chest. Cassia gently examined the first scabs he had probably ever borne across his knuckles. When she turned his hand over, she noticed for the first time that his fingers didn't have prints. D-lines didn't have prints? How had she never noticed this before? The overhead lights turned off. She stayed anxiously awake, listening to Jude's breathing. It was the only sound. There was no hum of ventilation or buzz of electric boxes. There were no echoes of technicians beyond the walls, and there was no light to see by. The concrete was hell on her knees. She crawled onto the pad and contemplated the director's words about her further options. He wouldn't just let her leave postpartum if there was a chance she would sue Primia for the abduction. Primia could probably just counter-litigate for theft of proprietary genetic material or claim she had compromised their billion-dollar asset. She was a base-level technician, insignificant and replaceable. Maybe they'd try to buy her off instead. Surely Primia had buried scandals before, making headlines vanish. No D-line research was clean. She ground her teeth when she thought it, but if Jude's work and routine were critical, and now contingent on Cassia being his mate, Collett wouldn't turn her loose for any price. She wondered if the director would want further experimental hybrid fetuses if Cassia brought this one to term. It was revolutionary, scientifically speaking, but still criminal. Alternatively, if she was physiologically compatible, forcing Cassia to be a surrogate for D-line embryos would be less risky and keep Jude's genetics in the market. Or Collett could simply imprison her as a pacifier while he kept up Jude's expensive contracts he'd mentioned. What kind of contracts could Jude possibly be a part of, outside of Primia's breeding agreements? Collett had mentioned chemtechs, but all the chemical engineer positions Cassia knew of were in the grow labs across the state. Their work was even more classified, focused on genetically templating proto-D-lines. It wouldn't make sense that Jude would be transported out of the building to assist them. Maybe some of the proprietary material was being brought to Primia instead? Hours later, the overhead lights turned back on. Jude didn't stir right away, but Cassia staggered awake, legs numb, eyes narrowed to adjust. Jude started pulling larger breaths through his nose, knitting his eyebrows together. She laced her individually printed fingers into his blank ones and squeezed softly. When he opened and focused his eyes, he looked sorry. "I hurt you," he said hoarsely, and raised his other hand to touch her forehead. Cassia squeezed his arm. "I'll be okay. Are you okay?" "Yes," he said, and ran his thumb gently down the neat line of stitches. Then he turned his bruised face into her lap and inhaled deeply. "The baby is okay, too." Guilt slapped Cassia at his words. She hadn't spared a single thought about the outcome for the fetus. It was the problem to overcome, the hurdle to put behind her. She didn't want to think about it. But Jude's tenderness made the contrast obvious. She was the cold, empty habitat for the baby. Chapter 10. Jude rolled to his hands and knees, then pushed himself up to stand. Either his internal clock was well calibrated, or the security behind the cameras above had been waiting for ambulation, because a set of peripheral lights that followed the ceiling's circumference turned blue. The door at the end of the blue painted line on the floor opened. Cassia moved to trail Jude as he followed the paint, but she was a beat too late. The door snapped shut in her face. She stood there, insulted. Hadn't she just spent the entire night at Jude's side, worried sick? And he had just left without explanation? Why did he leave? When would he come back? There was no window, knob, or hinge on the inside of the door. It was flush with the wall, even curving with it. Cassia couldn't get a finger in the groove. She knocked, then pounded on it without an answer. Barefoot, she followed the wall around the perimeter of the room. The far end had the floor drain. When she stepped out onto it, a shower of water rained down from a fixture high above. It was inhospitably cold. She let it run for a few minutes, but unlike the faucet at her apartment, it never grew any warmer. Cassia felt a new kind of trapped, despite the size of the room. No pictures, signs, or screens. No warning labels, no exit signs, just a continuous concrete wall. She began counting. 1 sleeping pad, 2 doors, 3 air vents, 6 cameras and 6 lights, arranged in a giant overhead asterisk. 18 sprinkler heads, excessive considering there was nothing here that could burn. The space was clearly designed to be sterile, free of anything that might harbor microbes. But it was also completely empty of stimulation. The longer she stood there, the more obvious it became. There weren't any avenues for suicide either. Cassia flinched when the ring of light suddenly turned green and the door opposite of Jude's blue line opened. She set her jaw and walked along the green paint to where a pair of habtechs waited to handcuff and escort her to another room in MedLab 1. Miguel was inside, booting up an ultrasound machine whose screen faced away from the stretcher. Cassia was laid flat for imaging and ignored when she asked to see the screen. She was ignored further when she asked where Jude had been taken. "I need to speak to Dr. Collett," she tried. "Are you even listening to me?" She sat up. The habtechs pushed her back down with practiced detachment. She realized that the shift from quarantine to the hab had given her a false sense of transformation. The night spent without handcuffs and the morning spent investigating the uniquely designed cell had given her courage to re-engage with her coworkers. These were people who'd she'd played eternal parking lot roulette with and shared pots of coffee. She might not know them personally, but she remembered their names by their ID badges. Was she no longer human to them? Her thoughts darkened. No wonder Jude had liked talking in the biolab. Her mind wandered, dissociating from the ultrasound wand below. She was brought back to the present as Miguel placed a new set of clothes at her side, identical to the ones Jude wore without buttons, pockets, zippers, or strings. Then he left the room. The habtechs took off 1 handcuff. She was meant to get changed. Cassia hoped they would turn around or look away. "What, right now? In front of you?" she challenged. They didn't reply, only waited. The humiliation of perhaps being stripped down and changed manually would be horrid. The shakedown years ago, when she'd accidentally taken the latex glove to the security checkpoint in her pocket, wouldn't compare, even though she'd cried all the way home in her car. Cassia needed to pick her battles carefully, and decided this one wasn't worth having. She turned around and shed the gown herself, then pulled on the new loose cotton shirt and pants. She was recuffed for the route back to Jude's hab. Jude was still gone. Cassia paced around the room like a wild-caught zoo animal, feeling her anger heating up again. She began shouting up at the ceiling. "Whoever's up there!" She squared up beneath each different camera. "Open the door! I need to talk to you!" There was no acknowledgement. The lights didn't even flicker or blink in Morse code. "Listen to me!" she pleaded. "I'm a human! I've been kidnapped!" To her shame, the shouts ascended to screams. "Somebody help me!" There was nothing to throw but a tantrum, nothing to break but her own spirit. She couldn't even lift the sleeping pad by herself. Cassia's head thundered from all the screaming, and she collapsed furiously on the drain that triggered the shower tap. The cold water soaked her through, drowning her thoughts and numbing her pounding head. Jude returned hours later. He rushed over and tugged her out of the waterfall. Cassia wiped the wet hair from her forehead and eyes, careful as it snagged in her stitches, then glared up with all the venom she could muster. "You've been gone all day!" She pushed him away accusingly. "Where were you?" "Work," Jude said, like a single-word text from the men she'd failed to date. "Where do you work?" Cassia challenged him, though it was perforated by the chatter in her teeth. "I smell things for Dr. Collett," he answered, and moved to pull her wet shirt off, then stared intensely at her stomach. Cassia smacked his hands away. "Don't touch me," she snapped. She was caught between wanting his attention and wishing she was talking to anyone else. The hours spent trying to bait someone into a fight were unresolved, and despite being possibly hypothermic, she was still feeling combative. Jude was too naive to engage, but he was all Cassia had. Cassia peeled off the top herself, then clapped her goosebumped arms over her chest. "Give me your shirt," she demanded. Jude cocked his head, trying to puzzle through her strange request. Cassia nearly screamed. "There are cameras! Do you want them to see me? Just give me your shirt!" "What's a cameras?" he asked. Cassia stared at him. Oh my God, she thought. He doesn't know. Her frustration deflated a little. She tried again, more politely. Can I borrow your shirt, please? He started pulling it over his head. For the first time, Cassia saw his torso in the light, and her goosebumps rose up again. The encounters in the dark storage closet had masked the absence of freckles, moles, or birthmarks, but more so that Jude didn't have a belly button. Coupled with the lack of fingerprints, it revealed how much she had been denying that Jude was a creation. She'd maybe even willfully ignored it in order to feel wanted by him. Still, those moments weren't fabricated. They were real. Why were you in the water? Jude asked when she put his shirt on. She peeled the soggy pants down to the ground and kicked them aside, trying not to look at him. I was upset, Cassia admitted, squeezing water out of her hair and shivering in short bursts. Why? He asked. Cassia heard the echo of Cassian's tiny toddler voice in her head. Why? 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 Her reply came out a snarl. Because I didn't know where you were, okay? She stormed away from him over to the sleeping pad, sat down, and pulled her knees up to her chest. She hid her face from Jude and from the cameras. Tears tracked down her nose. Jude approached and crouched down, trying to peer up through her arms. Cassia realized she had completely underestimated his lack of socializing, thanks to the routine in the biolab, where he knew how to sit and when to stand. He was a totally different animal in the hab, and so was she. You are still upset? Jude verified carefully. Cassia wondered what would happen if she hit him. Not that she would, but predictably a door would open. She would be removed from the hab for Jude's protection. But then what? She didn't want to be alone. Shame and exhaustion drained the anger away by the time Cassia sniffed out, Yes, I'm upset. I need to sleep. She laid down, facing away from him. Jude considered a moment, then laid down next to her, still careful not to touch her. The lights turned off. Chapter 11. They slept until the asterisk of overhead lights turned back on. Without a blanket, Cassia had tucked into Jude's chest for warmth sometime in the night. When he shifted out from behind her, she tipped to one side and woke up. Wait, Jude, where are you going? Work? Tests, Jude answered, then walked out along the matching colored line to the second door when the peripheral lights turned green. It closed behind him. Cassia was starving and still without pants. She looked over at the soggy pile of her yesterday clothes and wished she had thought to lay them out flat. She stayed curled on the pad, feeling too low to waste energy pacing the hab again. Jude came back within the hour with a replacement shirt and a familiar band of tape around his elbow from a blood draw. Cassia's blood ran cold. Jude has just been to the biolab. They had replaced her. It was Friday. Who drew your blood today? She asked. I don't know, Jude said. I never smelled him on anyone. Cassia's curiosity surged on the on anyone part. You remember everyone's smell, even if you haven't met them in person? Yes, he confirmed. She wondered if that meant Jude had known Leo's or Cassian's smell, but didn't ask. She wasn't sure she could handle it. What else do you smell? What do you smell for work? Jude struggled to answer, but managed to say, not safe things. The ring of lights turned blue and he left, without a goodbye, again. They switched to green for Cassia as soon as Jude's work door closed. Driven more by the hope for food than pants, she submitted herself to the habtechs. There was another ultrasound. Cassia tried more politely to ask Miguel for the director, but her request was met with an equal silence to the day prior. After imaging, she was injected with a series of shots that she hoped were only supplements, then given a tray of food packets. Cassia ate everything, then changed into the new set of clothes that he left at her side. She was returned to the hab in a better mental state than when she had left it, but with the lingering frustration of wanting to speak with the director again, if only for the chance to tempt him into an argument. When Jude rejoined her in the evening, Cassia's instinct to touch him stalled as she thought of the cameras above. What did the people watching even think of her anymore? Their opinion couldn't be good, but it probably also couldn't get worse. She decided to treat them with the same indifference they gave her, then wrapped her arms around Jude, resting her cheek on his shoulder. He caught on to the concept quickly, returning the embrace with curiosity, then intensity. "You smell different," he said, with some notable concern, then looked to her shoulder. Cassia hiked up her sleeve to show him the needle puncture marks, a place where she had also very recently been giving him weekly boosters. Miguel hadn't left so much as a bandage. Jude pushed his face to her skin and inhaled deeply twice. Cassia waited. Eventually he reported, "Those are safe. He'll be okay." He? Cassia wondered out loud, then belatedly realized Jude had meant the baby, not Miguel. "You can tell that it's a he already?" "Yes," Jude said. Cassia's throat suddenly felt tight, and she turned her head away. Thoughts of Cassian slipped through the cracks in her defenses. She hated thinking about Cassian. He had looked so exactly like Leo that she'd been furious. It was somehow a divine mockery, confirming her inadequate maternity. It wasn't just postpartum depression. She and Cassian had never reached synchrony. Leo read parental studies, then explained how the trauma of her childhood separation may have shaped the way Cassia struggled to bond. "It's not your fault," he'd insisted. "You'll get the hang of it." He held his wife, he held his son, and he held all the quiet, aching space between them. Cassian had been almost 3 when he and Leo died in the wreck. Cassia's manager had rushed into the lab that Tuesday morning, out of breath, telling her that police officers were asking for her at the security checkpoint. She'd hurried out to meet them, but now wished she'd taken longer, because every moment before they delivered the news was a moment she still had Leo. After the shock wore off and she was finally able to drive home, Cassia locked herself in her bedroom closet. It was there, between sleeves of coats and pairs of shoes that would never be worn again, that the dark truth hit her. She'd been relieved of the impossible task of motherhood. She was free. It wasn't that she hadn't loved Cassian, but she felt like she'd underperformed every day. His death felt like being fired from a job she never should have applied for. She only wept for Leo. In the weeks following the wreck, everyone told her how sorry they were. First, it was her manager, the coroner, and the funeral director. Then it was the estate attorney, the insurance agent, the realtor, the inspector, and even the wife of the other deceased driver. They all apologized for Leo's death, of course, but they were tragically sorrier that Cassian had been killed. People she hardly knew mailed in or dropped off sympathy cards, flowers, and teddy bears. Cassia thanked them, but secretly threw it all in the trash. She couldn't tell them. She wouldn't ruin their virtuous sorrow with her ugly confession. Cassia wondered again what would happen to Jude's baby. She paused. Jude's baby, her mind had called it. Not their baby. Certainly not her baby. She bit her lip. The director had made it clear that the fetus was already the property of Primia, a secret illegal asset. But her detachment wasn't political. It was personal. She wasn't sure she could survive another failure. "You are upset again?" Jude asked. "Yes, but not at you." Cassia slid her fingers into his hand softly. "Okay." His voice lifted with excitement. "Can I show you a thing?" Cassia raised an eyebrow. What could he possibly have hidden in this concrete vault that she hadn't seen? Still, she nodded and followed him. He led her to the drain where she'd activated the shower the day before. Then he continued a few panels further to the left. When he put his weight to it, the same tap high above them released a stream of water, this one hot enough to steam. Cassia laughed, and then covered her face as it mutated into a sob. Why was he being so sweet? Couldn't he tell what kind of person she was? Shouldn't that be something he could smell? Like when dogs mistrust criminals? Her shame came out as an accusation and a plea. She pushed away from him and yelled, "Why did you choose me, Jude?" Jude wasn't afraid of her anger. He didn't flinch away or defend himself or mock her. He only looked into her face and waited for a moment before answering, his eyebrows gathering in the middle. "You are safe." She looked up and away from him, tears making hot tracks down her cheeks. Safe? She wasn't safe. She was a monster. Maybe Jude was trying to calm her down, telling her she was safe with him in the hab. Or he could just be trying to explain that her pregnancy wasn't dangerous. He might just think she was a safe person because she had always been nice to him. Cassia looked back down across the space between them. Jude was waiting quietly for her to make the next move. She felt crazy and feral next to the measured patience. It made it all the more obvious that she was trying to push him away so she could blame him for leaving. It would be easier than feeling how much she blamed herself. If she had been a good mom, Leo wouldn't have been the one driving Cassian to the pediatrician the day they were hit. If she had been a good person, she would have traded jobs before letting any of this happen. If she had been a good daughter... She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing the thought back. When she opened them again, Jude hadn't moved. She glanced with resignation at the nearest camera, then took off her clothes and set them a dry distance away before stepping back onto the hot water panel. She swallowed the lump in her throat and asked, "Will you come shower with me?" Jude shed his own clothes and nuzzled in close. She quietly stroked his stomach where it was smooth instead of scarred from an umbilical cord. He stroked hers back, pushing his thumb softly into her belly button with fascination. She hoped he still wanted her, despite how unglued she felt, and was relieved to find out that he did. They slept on the pad when the lights turned out. The humidity was high enough from the shower steam that one of the vents hummed high above, possibly a dehumidifier. Cassia was hungry again already, but dozed off comfortably nestled in the curve of Jude's body, her fingers weaved through his. Hours later, Jude was shouting for her somewhere up above. She gasped for air, shot up, and crashed into his arms, headfirst in the dark. "What's wrong? What happened?" She grabbed his arms, felt his pulse beating fast. "You screamed," he answered. She felt her forehead where her stitches stung from scraping them. "What?" "You were scared," he told her, his own voice terrified. It took Cassia a moment to understand, and she sighed as she put it together. "Oh, geez, I was dreaming, Jude, that's all." "What is dreaming?" he asked, still nervous. Cassia knelt back down onto the pad. "Dreaming is... it's what happens when you sleep," she said. "You know, when your head makes pictures like memories or stories. Haven't you had a dream before?" "No," he said, still standing above her. Jude either didn't understand or delines didn't dream. Could that mean they didn't have REM cycles? Not all species did. Maybe Jude only experienced slow wave sleep. "It's okay," Cassia sighed tiredly. "Dreams aren't real. Just go back to sleep." "You smelled scared," Jude persisted. Cassia had explained this sort of thing before to Cassian, and she tugged Jude back down to the pad. "Sometimes dreams are bad. They're called nightmares. But they can't hurt you. I'm okay. I promise." He finally relaxed, wrapping his arm down around her before asking, "What is promise?" She took a moment to search for a simple explanation. "A promise is when you mean something to be true. You make it real. I promise I'm okay. If it happens again, just wait for it to be over." This was enough to satisfy Jude into going back to sleep, but it left Cassia more widely awake. She wondered what Jude made of his own existence. His life wasn't designed to be overtly cruel or break him into submission. There's hot water, for goodness sake. But it was built to keep him ignorant. He'd never been above ground. He'd never walked alone. Genetically, preventing delines from dreaming could be another method of control. Dreams were linked to the development of emotional regulation and social cognition. They unlocked subconscious desires, sparked ideas, or resurrected horrors. Without any of these, Jude simply was, like a machine that didn't know it was running. He had memory, emotion, and instinct, but no ambition, no hope. A part of Cassia was righteously angry for Jude, another darkly jealous of him. It would be nice to be free of nightmares or ignorant of her cages, but that was part of being a human. They were in the same room, laying on the same ground, and breathing the same air, but Jude might as well live on a different planet. The thought made her feel alone, even while he held her tightly. Chapter 12. Over the next week, Miguel collected her vitals and performed an ultrasound daily, then gathered any number of blood draws, finger sticks, or membrane swabs. For having phlebotomy training herself, Cassia's tolerance for being stuck with a needle was low. She looked away each time. After all of it, he provided a tray of food packets. They were the same tasteless, dense bars and thick, bland gels from her quarantine. No dishes needed, eliminating the chance of contamination. Nothing raw or fresh to harbor bacteria. She wasn't even allowed to bring anything back to the hab to eat later. Jude must have been eating at work because he likewise never returned hungry. His routine was narrow and militant. Each time they parted, Cassia asked him to tell her where he was going, but there were only two possibilities, two colors on the ring of lights when the doors opened: blue for work and green for tests. And Jude's tests only happened on Fridays. It became the mechanism by which she kept track of the days because her own tests were performed daily. She discovered that Jude didn't have her same notion of time when she had begun fidgeting with her stitches and wishfully muttered, "These better come out tomorrow." "What is tomorrow?" he'd asked. "It's, tomorrow, the day after today," she tried to explain. He didn't quite get it. The next day, after returning from work, he peered at the new skin where the stitches had, in fact, been removed and verified. "Is it tomorrow now?" Cassia rubbed her head, trying not to give in to the urge to scratch. She hadn't realized time was so abstract. Yes, sort of. But there's another tomorrow, the one after today. Tomorrow happens after you sleep." If time held no structure for Jude, Cassia wondered whether he knew how old he was, or if he remembered enough of his past to mark time at all. She reached out for his hand and held it. Did he have memories from the Grow Lab? Or had his life only ever been measured in increments of lights and doors? Her own life was divided by ages, cities, jobs, and people. She hadn't thought anything would divide it as strongly as the before and the after of Leo. But the chasm of the before and after of her abduction was growing deeper. On the weekend, there was a different staff rotation, including the pair of Habtechs. Cassia didn't recognize them. Their 48-hour shifts had never overlapped with her own 9 to 5. She counted less than a dozen people total, including Collett, who knew her location, but decided to stop trying to speak with them. She couldn't afford the feelings their inhumane silence cost her. She was grateful to discover that another panel below the Hab shower released a limited amount of soapy water each day, something that Jude had already known. There wasn't anything she could do about body hair, but Jude didn't know the difference. When she had grown concerned about the length of her fingernails, and even started to consider biting them, Miguel clipped them before giving her a change of clothing. It wasn't lost on her that she hadn't been handed the clippers to do it herself. After she had marked 2 weeks in the Hab, Miguel was joined by another technician who operated an MRI machine. Its pulsing electronic buzzes were the closest thing Cassia had heard to music since the morning commute in her car the day that she was imprisoned. In the hours that Jude was gone, Cassia's nervous energy pressurized. There were no clocks or windows, news flashes or advertisements, no chores. She couldn't distract herself, so she walked barefoot around the perimeter of the Hab clockwise one day, then counterclockwise the next, feeding thoughts that ranged between violent escape fantasies and dark regrets. Her childhood nightmares returned, sometimes multiple in a night. Jude would nudge her awake, and they both would try to reset, but she often couldn't fall back asleep or didn't want to. Instead, she walked the perimeter in the dark, one hand trailing along the wall. Jude wouldn't go back to sleep. He would wait for her. Interrupting Jude's sleep too often led to Miguel adding some kind of serotonin reuptake inhibitor to her daily regimen. She'd been on them before, even during her pregnancy with Cassian. The nightmares waned, and Jude told her it was safe for the baby, but Cassia felt guilty as it took familiar effect, numbing her inner storm. She shouldn't be relaxed. She was a prisoner. This wasn't vacation. She needed to stay angry so she could figure a way out of this. When Jude returned each evening, she had nothing to report from the med lab. Jude likewise couldn't explain his work within the limits of their shared language. He would try to describe the textures and shapes of things, but Cassia couldn't piece his descriptions into any clear mental picture. She was nearly hysterical when she realized it was just like her after-work check-ins had been with Leo, where she hadn't been allowed to talk about her classified work in the biolab, and Leo's floral shop talk was mostly the Latin names of plants. Luckily, Jude didn't need to share words as much as he needed to read her mood in his own way. He would greet her with a hug and spend several long moments inhaling her scent before kneeling to check on his developing child. Whatever he smelled in Cassia, he interpreted it into levels of touch or distances of space. Their evenings were brief before lights out, but they fell into the routine of showering together, Jude moving in for intimacy when he detected she was open for it. There was no mirror, but Cassia didn't need one to know she didn't look anything like a professional anymore. On a whim, she began to braid her hair after squeezing it over the drain one evening. Jude was fascinated. He had seen her hair in braids before, back in the biolab, but the look on his face now was more analytical than curious. He leaned in closely to watch the pattern of Cassia turning her fingers and twisting her wrists to weave the parts together. "Do you want to try?" Cassia asked after making it through the length of her hair. "Yes," he answered immediately. She reversed the braid and shook out the tangles, then sat in front of him as he experimentally replicated her work. When he had successfully made it to the bottom, he asked, "Now what?" Cassia paused, then searched the hem of her shirt and snapped a stitch with her teeth, pulling out a small length of thread. She reached for the braid, looped the thread several times around, then tied a knot. Jude observed, deeply quiet. The braiding became an extension of their nightly shower ritual. Having her hair restrained came to good use when Cassia developed morning sickness a week later. Each daybreak began with a nausea roller coaster of unknown duration, sometimes before the lights had even turned on. There was no trash can, no toilet, no mixing bowl, so she threw up into the floor drains and flushed with the shower tap. It would be more disgusting if the habitat wasn't being sanitized daily while she was away in the med lab. Cassia was still irrationally paranoid about using it as a toilet in front of Jude, though she had given up caring about what the cameras saw. One morning, during her 5th week in the hab, Jude thoughtfully observed, "You need something." He had his hand on her back in the dark while she heaved into the drain on her hands and knees. She trembled but didn't move, trying to steady her spins. She needed a lot of things. Towels, a hamburger, a lawyer, freedom. Unfortunately, Jude didn't understand sarcasm, so she kept it to herself and sat up. "What do you mean, Jude?" He searched for the words. "Your body had something. The baby has it now, so it's low." "Deficiency," she told him, understanding. "Being low means being deficient." She laid back on the pad, which they had dragged closer to the drain when she'd started puking regularly. Jude petted her stomach and said, "You need to fix it. It's not safe." Cassia wasn't equipped to fix anything, but Jude was even less so. Her head swam. "Can you tell me what the deficiency is?" She swallowed and specified. "What's low?" "I don't know names," he confessed. "It's bendy gray, but no holes." The words made no sense. Cassia was confused, no matter how many times he tried to clarify. She rolled off the pad for another round of heaves. The way Jude had described his work in chemical detection sounded to Cassia a lot like how law enforcement trained scent hounds. Jude was given a good example of a concentrated dose of a target smell, then tasked with detecting trace amounts of its presence or its absence in a medium. It didn't require any education, just the ability to detect and indicate with precision. Over 22,000, Collett had said. In the med lab later that day, Cassia could only stomach the gel and liquid pouches. It had been the same during her pregnancy with Cassian, 6 weeks of surviving on nothing but seltzer and crackers. Her doctor had assured her the baby would take what it needed, even if it meant pulling nutrients from her bones and organs. She'd felt hijacked. Miguel at least seemed to be noting which of the muted flavors were the least offensive, and she found multiple of them on the tray. Back in the hab, she laid down for a foggy nap. The click of the door would wake her when Jude returned. She dozed long enough to realize that it was getting late. Without a clock, she couldn't be sure, but it felt like Jude should have been back already. She stood up and nervously paced the wall, slowing down near Jude's work door each time she passed by. It felt like nearly lights out when the perimeter colors turned red. She'd never seen them turn red. Jude's work door opened and a habtech entered. He summoned her forward. Chapter 13. Cassia was taken only a short distance to a disappointingly empty room labeled Chem Lab 1. It had a long, empty, stainless steel countertop and a plain door at the far end. There were only 2 chairs, facing each other across the counter. Dr. Collett was sitting in one. It was the first time she had seen him in more than a month. "Sit down," he told her. She sat. "Today, Jude told the chemtechs you were sick," Collett began. "He asked to visit our chemical library to name your deficiency." The way he said the word was meant to reveal how closely he had monitored the surveillance, at least from this morning. "I was alerted to this behavior and gave the clearance to allow it. But I need you to understand something. Jude making requests is a bad thing, even if the requests are harmless. If he becomes too compromised, we will lose control. People will die." That seemed a little dramatic. Jude wasn't dangerous. Cassia's disbelief must have been obvious because Collett decided to try and convince her. He took his glasses off. A year ago, state detectives from Brooklyn, New York, contracted Primia to find an escaped felon. They suspected he was in the sewer system and sent us 108 samples of water from various underground locations. Jude was able to detect the man's urine concentration to within a city block of where he was found hiding. He let that settle, then continued. 3 months ago, Jude detected ammonium nitrate embedded in raw cotton shipped from Pakistan to Turkey. The fibers were chemically treated to pass import inspections, then dissolved on arrival to extract all explosive material. Primia's detection exposed 2 sister cells of the same terrorist network operating between Multan and Istanbul. Collett threaded his fingers together. And yesterday, Jude finished identifying a trace gas dissolved in a sample of cattle feed being exported from Brazil to China. The gas was designed to poison cattle before slaughter, making its way into commercial beef products. It causes 6 different known cancers in humans. China bought 30,000 tons. Collett leaned forward. This work is international, geopolitical. Do not make the mistake of thinking your life is worth more than millions of others. Do not compromise Jude. Cassia hadn't known Primia was operating outside of their research sector at all. In the past few weeks, she had thought Jude's chemical sensitivity was being put to use extending its own internal genetic research, not being used for external contracting. And even if she had imagined Jude was working as a consultant, she could have guessed that he was part of a public health anti-drug campaign, intercepting cocaine laced with fentanyl, or opioids smuggled in mail. Knowing he was essentially a counterintelligence weapon for hire explained Collett's possessiveness. Pieces began falling in place in Cassia's mind. Jude's chemical detection was probably more lucrative than breeding him, because Collett didn't seem upset enough that Primia couldn't auction off another deline offspring. It also explained why Collett had put her in the hab after quarantine instead of working some other angle. If keeping Jude working was the primary goal, it meant husbandry was a convincing diversion, but it still left the question open of why Dr. Collett had chosen to keep the hybrid fetus at all, unless he was counting on Jude's chemical detection to be genetically inherited. When she said nothing, Collett replaced his glasses and leaned back. You're deficient in zinc. He motioned for the Habtech to re-enter. You'll be getting a supplement starting tomorrow. Almost everything Cassia had thought to say before this moment vanished. She had performed dozens of imaginary negotiations in her head over the past few weeks, but in light of what he had just told her, she narrowed it down to one play. Director, can I take pillows from the med lab? I need support. Collett paused the Habtech with a raised finger and genuinely considered her request. You may, but I have a condition. She lowered her head slightly, but kept her eyes level. What would he want? Tell Jude to never ask for the chem library again. In that moment, Cassia got what she was looking for, and it wasn't permission to take pillows. It was the knowledge that she had more control over Jude's behavior than the director did. She didn't immediately fulfill the request when she saw Jude waiting for her in the hab. Instead, she hugged him tightly, stalling. He would know what the words meant, but he wouldn't understand all they implied. Cassia waited until he asked to braid her hair, then sat quietly on the pad. The lights turned off, but Jude continued alternating the locks of hair in the dark, undisturbed. Maybe she could outmaneuver Collett and still hold up her end of the bargain. Jude, she began. Yes, he replied. Next time you want to go to the chem library, you need to ask me first. You can't ask the chemtechs. Why? He asked. She used his own words that could mean life or death. It's not safe. His fingers paused in her hair. Had she scared him? Or would he catch her meaning? Okay, she prompted him. Okay, he agreed. Chapter 14. Jude was visibly enthusiastic the following evening. He'd immediately detected her first dose to correct the deficiency. Cassia realized this might be one of the few times he had gotten closure or felt true purpose regarding something he'd detected as not safe. He'd certainly never been paid for his work, despite his contractees possibly writing checks for hundreds of thousands of dollars. She proudly showed him her own trophy, the pillows on the bed. Jude had seen pillows before in the med lab, no doubt, but he had never used them for sleep. Cassia felt like Jane to his Tarzan, introducing the comforts of civilization. But his jungle was empty, clearly designed to be understimulating in order to keep him well calibrated for work. Work was all he knew. Cassia was going to change that. Jude, I want to teach you a game. She pulled a pillowcase free and knotted it up into a lumpy wad. What is game? He asked. A game is when you play. It's for fun, she explained. He obviously wasn't clear on those words either, but he focused instead of asking. Cassia tossed the makeshift ball up into the air and caught it. He watched with the same face as when she had first braided her hair. He wanted to try. I'm going to throw this to you. You don't let it touch the ground. You catch it. She demonstrated the catch again. Jude was great at catch. Cassia had to remind herself again that he wasn't unintelligent just because she stood on a larger vocabulary. His throwing gained rapid accuracy over the hour. They threw increasingly larger distances. Then she knotted a second pillowcase and threw it at a random distance or direction. Jude tried to intercept it with his own. She wanted to see if she could hit any of the overhead cameras, but decided that was a little too transparent. Before long, Cassia was laughing. Jude smiled. She changed the game to a version of hide-and-seek, where she stayed in place, closed her eyes, and guessed where he was by throwing the ball. She missed each time, then made him close his eyes so she could take a turn hiding. His throws were dead on 4 turns in a row before Cassia picked up the pillowcase that had just whacked her in the leg and demanded to know, How do you know where I am? Your smell, he nodded, victorious. That's cheating, Cassia teased him and closed her eyes, motioning for him to take a turn hiding again. What is cheating? He asked, then moved. Cheating is when you lie or break the rules. Cassia paused and realized that if she were listening to the surveillance, she would consider this a dangerous concept to teach, the idea that rules could be broken. Would teaching Jude to hide and seek also compromise him? Or would it prepare him to survive? She threw the ball and missed spectacularly. The lights turned off. She felt around in the dark, then unknot the cases to resheath the pillows. They laid down together, and she touched his face softly. She hadn't kissed him. Not once. Not even in the closet. Kissing was human, which made it somehow more intimate than the sex. It was something Jude hadn't learned. Jude, I want to teach you something else, she began. Is it another game? He asked. No, she answered, not really. It can be for fun, but mostly it's for love. What is love? He wanted to know. Love is when you care about a person. You want them to be safe and feel good, like you loved your mate, and like I loved mine. He absorbed her words quietly. Cassia stroked his cheek with her thumb. I love you, Jude. She kissed his forehead, then his nose, leading down to his mouth. When she kissed him on the mouth, she was slow, allowing him time to carefully analyze the feeling. Then he kissed her back, and it was like watching him learn how to throw, an awkward first attempt, followed by quick mastery. Cassia recalled an article about the biochemistry of kissing, how saliva transmitted information like hormones and enzymes between genetically compatible bodies. Kissing someone could succeed or fail at a microscopic level, ringing in as intuition. Jude hadn't needed to kiss her to intuit their chemical affair, but Cassia felt the truth of it as she tasted him and wanted more. Minutes into it, Jude made love to her like he would never see her again. Cassia would say that the kissing lesson was a complete success, and she was already planning to show him more ways to use his mouth tomorrow. Breathless, he rested his forehead to hers, kissed her one more time, and whispered, I love you, Cassia. Chapter 15. The next week, she started to show. It was harder to tell without mirrors or photos to compare herself to, but the passage of time and her dodgy appetite worked together to reveal a bump. Cassia covered it with her waistband, but couldn't ignore how it changed the way she looked when she laid down on the sliding MRI table. Jude hadn't said anything about her shape change, but when she thought about it, he actually hadn't commented on her body's fluctuating sizes ever. When she returned to the hab to nap, it would smell recently sterilized, which luckily wasn't the kind of smell to set off her stomach again. The pillows and sleeping pad were thankfully washed with something unscented. As she curled up on them one afternoon, waiting to drift off, she felt a series of small, burp-like flutters in her stomach. This was confusing, because she was sure she hadn't lost track of time that badly. Her guess was that she was only 10 or 11 weeks pregnant, which made the bubbles and taps of a quickening unlikely. Thanks to her ex-coworkers in the med lab, she still hadn't seen an ultrasound picture or an MRI frame. She could be carrying a litter of kittens for all she knew. Unwilling to believe she had lost count of the weeks, she decided it must be digestive. She was wrong. The longer she laid there quietly, the more she felt them, the tiny, curious nudges under her navel. It was the softness and the smallness of them that drew her hands to her stomach, wanting to feel him flutter again after each pause. If he was already big enough to feel, did that mean she was halfway? D-lines had been designed for rapid development in labs, but she hadn't anticipated it would be similar in utero. She decided to ask Jude when he got back from work how many Fridays his mate had carried their offspring. She was embarrassed to realize she had never kept track. She hadn't ever even seen a photo of Jude's mate or his children. But that's how Primia seemed to do all of its business, isolating every project, person, and D-line into sterile boxes. A loud hissing noise suddenly burst overhead, breaking the usual eerie silence of the hab. Cassia rolled to her feet, alarmed. A fine mist above began floating down as it was pressurized into vapor out of the sprinklers. But there wasn't a fire, and it wasn't water. Worry shot into panic. She smelled isopropyl alcohol. It was the cleaning system. But Cassia was in the hab. She shouted and waved her arms at the cameras before the tsunami of fumes crashed over her and she gagged. Her eyes burned. She squeezed them shut and erupted into violent, choking coughs. The system kept spraying the mist. Cassia bent over and gasped for air, now being displaced by the vapor. She tried to orient her way to the door. Her lungs felt like they were full of hornets, and she fell to her knees. Then she puked, everything but her actual stomach, and her arms buckled. She fell sideways. Despite her spasming body, Cassia suddenly felt as if she were floating on the ocean. The ground slowly rolled under her like waves. They grew taller and darker, then completely folded over her. She sank to the bottom and didn't remember hearing the click of the door opening. She did remember the moment when she tasted air again. Her brain screamed for it. Cassie had never wanted anything as much as her next breath, but it felt like inhaling with the lungs of an infant. She could only pull in a cupful at a time. Everything was dark, and Cassia swung and clawed at the space above her, trying to escape the squeezing pressure of her own ribs. The cleaning system. Someone had tried to kill her. Her arms were caught, then held down. Something scratched at her face, and she turned away, hacking raggedly. People were shouting all around. After weeks of silence, it sounded like there was a stadium of people calling her name. Water was poured over her head next, and she choked on that too, before sinking back under. Chapter 16. After the flashes of her rescue, Cassia woke up to a reprise of the concussion. It was worse. She was in the med lab again, but with a lot more than an IV up her arm. There was a mask on her face, leads all over her torso, IVs in both arms, and monitors filling the room with noise. She wasn't zipped or handcuffed to the stretcher, but the fizzing weakness in her limbs convinced Cassia she wasn't an escape risk. Her eyesight was blurry, but she could make out the sleeve of a haptech around the doorframe. When she turned her head to the side, she found the shape of the only person she wanted to see. "Jude?" She rasped and tried to sit up, then coughed weakly, fogging the mask on her face. "Stay still," he exclaimed and sprang to her side. The answer to the question, "Who let Jude in here?" walked into the room next, recognizable by the frames of his glasses. Cassia wheezed at him furiously. "What the hell happened?" The distance made his facial expression unreadable, but he spoke like a man who didn't have time to go into details. "Someone hacked our hab servers. They overrode all manual controls for habitat sterilization systems. 4 D-lines and 2 people were killed." Adrenaline shot through Cassia. "Did they kill the baby?" She started pulling for the sheets over her stomach. "No, he's okay," Jude answered, and put his hands on her shoulders to keep her from fighting upwards. Then he showed her what a medtech must have showed him. which was that a monitor was tracking the fetal heartbeat through leads on her abdomen. She couldn't see the screen as anything beyond a fuzzy glow, but she trusted Jude. Her next coughing fit gave the director time to decide what he was going to say before he left. There are organizations who are aware of the power of our work, and who either want it for themselves or want to stop it from being used against them. This wasn't their first attempt. The whole facility is on a 12-hour lockdown. When we get the all clear, you and Jude will be moved to a different confidential location. Cassia relaxed back into the stretcher. She was terrified of returning to spend another second beneath the murderous sprinklers. Primia had several auxiliary labs that she knew of, and perhaps more undisclosed locations. Jude petted her arm softly while she kept erupting into gradually decreasing episodes of coughs. Her lungs itched constantly. Her oxygen levels climbed slowly, but they climbed. If she wasn't so weak, Cassie realized this might have been her chance to finally make a dash for it. The facility might be in chaos. She could have come up with something, pulled a fire alarm, found her manager, anything. But, she realized as she mourned the lost opportunity, it would have killed her to leave Jude now, and she might not have run if he didn't follow her. For the first time, she got to see what Jude's work might look like. He had been unofficially appointed quality control for the dozens of victims of the chemical attack, smell testing everything used for treatment across the medical suite while Primia was locked down. A tech would arrive with a rolling cart, and Jude would spend several long, deep breaths over the cartridges, packets, or vials stacked within it. Drug doses, saline concentrations, and food ingredients all had to be determined safe before being administered. Cassia shuddered to imagine what would happen if she had been poisoned intravenously instead of aeriformly. 6 dead. Hours into the lockdown, Jude asked to smell the baby again, and peeled back the sheet over Cassia's abdomen. He put his face down and inhaled as usual, then turned his head to the side and rested it there, closing his eyes. Cassia fell asleep, but woke up to each clatter of passing groups of technicians evacuating delines from the other medical suites. Jude would wake too. The way he lifted his head and inhaled meant that he was trying to identify people's scents he knew, or curious about those he didn't. The director appeared outside the door twice to give orders to the Habtech, but didn't re-enter. Jude seemed satisfied that he no longer had to hold on to Cassia for her to remain alive, and started exploring around the room. He curiously opened drawers and examined tools. He found a rubber band and used it to secure Cassia's hair when he detangled and rebraided it later that evening. When she asked him to look for papers, hoping to see data about the pregnancy, he found and delivered a few, but her eyes couldn't focus at any distance. She wondered with dread if she was going to be blind. Dr. Collett finally arrived with delivery of Miguel and 3 pairs of Jude's designated Habtechs. Miguel detached everything from Cassia except the oxygen mask, which he rerouted to a mobile bottle mounted to the stretcher. As a single unit, they took a lift to the parking garage level and passed the security checkpoint. Jude wasn't even handcuffed, but the director must have known that he wouldn't leave Cassia, or it would have been arranged to have him secured. Everything from the lift door outward would be a different dimension for a deline. Cassia worried he would be overwhelmed, but reminded herself that Jude liked experiencing new things. He wasn't a hermit or a recluse who had retreated. He was a prisoner who had been born in his cell. Jude's blurry shape became the most curious when they passed the dark windows of a truck, and he saw himself reflected in the tinted glass. His hand never left the stretcher's rail, but he lingered. It occurred to Cassia that he had never seen his own face. All metallic surfaces in the bio, med, and chem labs were brushed stainless steel. "Did you—" she began, but started a round of coughing that lasted until they reached a double set of windowless courier vans. The Habtechs lifted the stretcher into the back of one, and Jude climbed in next to it. She tried again, her voice still hoarse. "Did you see your reflection in the windows?" "Reflection?" he asked. "Mm-hmm. The picture of yourself," she explained. She wanted to keep Jude calm as a cover-up for her own anxiety, but had to meter out her energy. The ride was an hour or more. Cassia fell asleep and lost track. Conversation drifted from the cab through the radios, but she couldn't make anything of it. Jude laced his fingers through hers, more quiet in the presence of so many techs at once. Her air tank beeped low minutes before the van stopped, and one of the back doors opened. They were in another parking garage. The driver poked his head in. "We're moving you to an ambulance." He motioned for Miguel and one of the Habtechs to lift the stretcher out. When Jude made to follow, a second and third Habtech blocked him. "Cassia!" Jude cried out. "We're splitting up. Miguel said. Why? Cassia demanded. Security breach, the Habtech snapped. Please, stop. Cassia sat up feebly. Miguel had to brake to get her to lay back down. Jude was shouting for her, struggling against the two Habtechs in the back of the van. He was going to get himself hurt. Jude, she said, as loud as she could, then coughed. She took off her mask and said without the muffle of the plastic, Jude, stop. Listen. It's okay. It's okay. The blurry shape of Jude quit yelling and listened. Miguel kept his hand on Cassia's shoulder, but didn't resume taking her away. Jude, we're going to the same place. I'll see you really soon, okay? Jude's face rotated from the Habtechs to Miguel, then Cassia. Okay, she pressed. Okay, he acknowledged, and the Habtech's hold on him relaxed. Miguel replaced Cassia's mask and backed her into an ambulance. The doors banged shut. Chapter 17. The ambulance drove straight through the night. Cassia's stretcher was unloaded and rolled through a short set of hallways. The pair of Habtech's radios crackled out a series of commands. Miguel gave the handoff to a nurse, and all three left quickly. Cassia didn't recognize the uniforms or equipment, though everything was still a little blurry. Even so, they were noticeably different brands from Primia's or its supporting labs. The bedside manner of the medical staff wasn't anything like a research facility. She realized this was their real job, and this was a private hospital. Had the security breach been bad enough to force a reroute? For the first time in months, the only thing keeping Cassia from running away was the absence of Jude. That, and the serious doubt that she could run. Her lungs were certainly phoning it in, but there were no handcuffs, no Habtech security, and no ID-locked doors. She was even above ground and could see open sky through the room's window. With her doubts about a physical escape, Cassia weighed the option of simply reporting Dr. Collett's abduction. This was the first real chance she'd had in months. All she had to do was catch the ear of a nurse who could call the police, who would put her in touch with a lawyer. She could be well protected in a matter of hours. She would have a voice again. What stopped her was that reporting Collett would mean abandoning Jude. There wasn't a lawyer alive who could free a deline. Did she love him that much? That she was wasting every minute she could be armoring up? It wasn't just love. It was fear. Fear of what would happen when the pregnancy was complete. If she ran, eventually the truth of the conception would get out, and she might spend the rest of her life in prison, like her mother. If she battled for her freedom in court, she probably couldn't even rely on sympathy from deline rights activists, who could spin her as an evil, abusive corporate, someone who had sexually exploited a captive deline. Her eyes were slowly regaining focus. She was able to read the plastic tag on her wrist with her full name and date of birth, her identity. But was she the victim here, or the criminal? Was she a traitor, or a survivor? Her confusion regurgitated the memory of being in graduate school, in her second-year genetic research seminar. It was a lecture hall divided over whether cloning a human was worse than designing one from scratch. Cloning humans was scientifically viable, but internationally illegal decades before she had begun her master's program. The world had agreed, at least on paper, that duplicating an existing human's individuality crossed a line too deep. The economic, social, and ethical costs were too obscure, so researchers had pivoted. They spliced genes and tweaked expression patterns until they had something close enough to mimic, but different enough to patent. Homo delineae. With less than 1% genetic divergence from Homo sapiens, deline development became the answer to the world's hunger for advanced medical testing. Delines could save billions of lives. What remained was the trick of stabilizing the species for mass production. That was Jude, and all of his previous children. Cassia clenched the bedsheets in both fists, furious. Her days in captivity had been spent fantasizing about an open door, and now she was paralyzed in its frame. Collett could return at any moment with his team of jailers, and she might as well have put the handcuffs on herself. She decided she just needed to know that Jude was safe and could wait a few hours. If she changed her mind, she could always press the emergency call button on her bedside remote. She finally had a choice. A thought pounced on her like it had been crouching in the dark, waiting. She had a choice. She didn't have to carry the baby to term anymore. The realization rooted slowly, then bloomed all at once. Most animals self-aborted if they determined the environment too dangerous or nutrients too scarce. It was completely natural. If she no longer carried evidence, Primia would never find out. If she no longer held the possibility of a secret tool, Dr. Collett might cut his losses. They might not hunt for her. Just as she considered the possibility, another thought stirred from the depths, slow and heavy as something in deep water. Would ending this pregnancy make her, once and for all, her mother's daughter? It had taken years for Cassia to know where to look, but the truth had been waiting all along. She found it in high school, during detention, while pretending to do homework in the computer lab, the article about how Cassia Vincent had gone to prison for strangling her second-born. She was caught trying to throw the body away in a city dumpster. Cassia's mother was a murderer. Thinking about it again made Cassia feel sick. She was never sure she'd wanted to be a mother, but she definitely didn't want to be anything like her mother. Cassia had failed uniquely with Cassian, but everything about her situation then had been different. This accidental pregnancy felt too similar, too fated to abandon. Her thoughts were arrested by a series of full-body coughs. They subsided after a few minutes, but not before her oxygen levels had dipped and set off an alarm. A nurse came to see her through, bringing another round of steroids to add to the drip line snaking from Cassia's arm. "Can I get you anything else?" he offered, once she could speak again. He had already brought water and tilted the stretcher more upright. Cassia had a request. An hour later, a radiologist brought their portable ultrasound machine to the ICU. They pivoted the screen so Cassia could see the baby for the first time, just a grainy gray curl floating in the dark fluid background. She watched as he twitched one small leg, pushing back against the pressure of the ultrasound wand. The radiologist adjusted the image a few times, taking measurements and offering warm praise. Cassia was busy swallowing back feelings that climbed like weeds up her aching throat. She asked for a print before they left. She held onto the photo and fell into an exhausted sleep. When she woke up, the day had purpled into night. Jude hadn't arrived yet. Something wasn't right. She pulled off her mask and summoned the after-hours staff, asking if anyone had called for her. No one had. The steroids had worked a miracle to tame her wild coughing, then alternately burned through her hard-won oxygen. There'd be no falling back asleep anymore. She tossed her blankets aside and alternated lying toward the window, then away from it. Was shunting Cassia to a private hospital part of Collett's strategy to keep the lid on her illegal pregnancy? Or was he only scattering assets to minimize the damage of another attack? Could separating them be a part of a larger design to turn Jude into leverage against her? Or worse? Cassia clenched her jaw as Collett's words about Jude's work slithered through her mind. There are organizations who either want it for themselves or want to stop it from being used against them. Anyone wanting to acquire a deline, one they couldn't afford, one that wasn't for sale, could have attacked the facility and watched the evacuation, waiting for the perfect opportunity. Like pouring water into an anthill to flush out the queen. At sunrise, a staff member handed Cassia a phone. She knew before she raised it to her ear that the news was bad. On the other end, Collett was frantic. Jude was missing. Someone had taken him. Both pairs of Habtechs were found dead in the van crashed off the highway. It had been a mistake not escorting Jude himself, but he would use every contact and all of Primia's power to recover him as fast as possible. He was dispatching privately contracted agents to come protect Cassia, in case whomever took Jude learned about his child. He gave her a passphrase to verify their identities and warned her to stay calm, but trust no one. Cassia watched the sun rise through the window as the director shouted to someone in the room with him, "Then call his commander!" before hanging up. She clutched the ultrasound print. This was her chance. She ran for 2.